Welcome to the ACT branch of the AIIA. My name's Heath McMichael and I'm president of the ACT branch. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also acknowledge members of the diplomatic corps who are here with us tonight. So tonight we're returning to an area of undisputed importance for Australia, the Pacific Island region. It's nearly 3 years since we last discussed the Pacific, on that occasion with the High Commissioners of PNG and Solomon Islands, who gave us their country's views on the many challenges facing the region. So it is high time we looked at our neighbourhood again, not least given the upturn in rhetoric around increased Pacific engagement and increasing foreign donor involvement there. Both things, it might be said, being driven by intense geopolitical competition as much as by recognition of the Pacific's development needs. Anyway, we're delighted that James Batley can lead the discussion tonight. James is a distinguished policy fellow at the Department of Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. Since 2015, he has taught and researched on Australia's relations with the Pacific, security and governance issues in the region, and particularly in Solomon Islands. Before taking up his uni position, James was a career diplomat. He had early postings in Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. He was appointed Australia's High Commissioner to Solomon Islands in 1997.
Oh, that's so long
Just
ago.
yesterday. He was Australia's first ambassador to East Timor at that country's independence in 2002. From 2004 to 2006, he led the Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands, and from 2007 to 2009, he served as Australia's High Commissioner to Fiji. In Canberra, he worked in a range of senior positions, including Deputy Director General of AusAid and Deputy Secretary of DFAT. James was awarded the Australian Public Service Medal in 2000 and the Cross of Solomon Islands in 2017. I can see one of those on your lapel anyway. Now, the format for tonight is that James will speak for around 20 minutes before we go to questions from participants in-house and from those online using the Q&A function on Zoom. And we aim to finish at 7 p.m. So over to James, please.
Heath, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. A great pleasure to be here. It was very foolish of me to volunteer to do this right at the height of an election campaign. Although I do note that, in fact, the Pacific hasn't featured as much as it did in 2022, when we had the Solomon Islands-China security agreement being the subject of much debate. So anyway, I want to offer some thoughts tonight about where Australia's relations with the Pacific sit today. And it's necessarily going to be impressionistic and pretty brief, to leave time for discussion. And spoiler alert, the picture it's a mixed one, okay? It's a mixed one for a number of reasons. Firstly, and very importantly, it doesn't make sense to think of the Pacific just as an undifferentiated blob all by itself, right? While they might speak with the same voice from time to time, Pacific Island countries have got different perspectives, different interests, and that's also reflected in Australia's relations with the range of Pacific Island countries. Secondly, the picture is mixed because while Australia certainly faces a range of serious challenges in the region, it has responded to these with, I think, some interesting and innovative policy initiatives. And I want to talk about those a bit later on in this talk. Finally, it seems to me that the picture is mixed because, frankly, it's always going to be mixed. And this is simply a result of the, I guess, the power differentials that exist between Australia and the region. It's not so much a matter of regret as a fact of life, I think, for anyone who's been in charge of managing relations with the Pacific will, I think, be familiar with what I'm talking about. So let me just make some general remarks about the way that Australian governments approach the Pacific. And perhaps this is an appropriate time to say this, But despite what some of our politicians would like us to believe, I think the substance of Australia's approach to the Pacific is characterised much more by bipartisanship and policy consensus than by contestation. Okay? No doubt there are some differences in tone and emphasis between the two major sides of politics when it comes to the Pacific. But by and large, I think Pacific policy has evolved through steady accretion and accumulation, not great zigzags over recent decades, even if the evolution of policy has accelerated somewhat in the past decade. Now, if we could go to the next slide, please. This shows two quotes by Penny Wong talking about our region. And I put this up and I use it in my teaching because I think it illustrates one of the basic tensions or balancing acts in Australia's approach to the Pacific. So that first quote, you know, the minister saying we want to listen to our Pacific Island neighbours, okay? And it was the theme from day one when she recorded a video message and issued that. The second quote, I think it's actually talking about the broader Indo-Pacific region, but it applies equally in the Pacific region, is where she's talking about shaping our region, okay? And I think there clearly is potentially, at least, there's a tension between these ideas of listening and of shaping our region. I think it's another way of thinking about that is the difference between Australia acting as a partner in the Pacific on the basis of sovereign equality with our Pacific Island neighbours, and Australia being a leader in the Pacific, Australia setting an agenda, influencing the way that countries think about the world, engage internationally. Okay, so as I say, I think that's a kind of inbuilt tension that Australian governments of either persuasion need to wrestle with. Another way of thinking about it, that tension, I think maybe it's the difference between Australia thinking about the Pacific as a source of opportunity versus thinking about the Pacific as a source of threat. Okay, and again, I think these two poles are ever present, and I think that's one of the jobs of government is to get that balance right. It's not always easy, not easy to achieve, but I think that challenge is unavoidable for Australian governments. And I mean, the way that governments normally try and get around this issue rhetorically is to talk about Australia being, of course, partner of choice. A set of words I'm sure you're familiar with, but that partner of choice expression really covers up that whole tension. Now, I'm going to show you just one more slide. It's the last one. If we could move on to the next one. This is I guess what I call it's a model of what I'm calling Australia's abiding preoccupations when it thinks about, or when policymakers think about the Pacific. Okay, and as you can see, I think there are three broad clusters of ideas, or three clusters of preoccupations, all of which overlap and influence each other. You've got at the top reasonably, I think, self-explanatory, Australia's own access and influence in the Pacific as a core policy preoccupation. You've got the access and influence of others, other players. Now, those other players can be our friends and allies, they can be our adversaries, they can be non-state parties, they could be, I don't know, international criminal networks. That equally is a preoccupation of policymakers. But then the final cluster there is about what's the word I've used? Vulnerability, fragility. There's a range of different ideas caught up there. I mean, we could think in terms of instability, could think in terms of underdevelopment. So as I say, there's a range of different ways of expressing that. But the basic idea is that independent of for instance, of geopolitics, you know, the state of development in a place like Solomon Islands, in and of itself, is a matter that engages Australia's national interests. So that is a distinct category of policy concerns for Australian governments. And I think that's not, it can be a useful rubric when we're thinking about how do we assess where Australia is in the region in 2025. Although I repeat what I said earlier, that we can't just think about the Pacific as a single entity. So if we go through those clusters of issues one by one, starting on the bottom left with vulnerability, fragility, it is very clear that a number of countries in the region, but particularly in Melanesia, continue to face really daunting development challenges. Economies are not growing fast enough to absorb the growing workforces, kids coming out of schools, of primary schools and high schools, let alone growing enough to drive a growth in incomes. State institutions, again, mainly in Melanesia, are not strong. In countries like Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, you can go to villages that are almost untouched by the state. You can do surveys, and people do these surveys. When was the last time you saw a police officer, or how long does it take to walk to your nearest clinic, and so on. So that interaction between citizens and the state is very weak. These are all persistent challenges. And if I might paraphrase Penny Wong, you might say we are in a permanent contest in at least parts of the Pacific with poverty and underdevelopment. Meanwhile, the future of places like New Caledonia and Bougainville, very uncertain. We don't know where those situations are going to end up. Climate change, another source of vulnerability, particularly for small island atoll states, but not only. Now, all of that, those clusters of development challenges, they're not necessarily Australia's to solve, but they do touch on Australia's interests, and Australia can't afford not to be engaged in addressing them. Thinking about the second cluster of preoccupations on the bottom right, I think Penny Wong is to be commended for acknowledging that we are in a permanent contest with China in the region. You know, we've had this so-called diplomatic thaw with China over the last 3 years, but China is a persistent threat to us in the Pacific. And I think we're seeing a convergence of factors there. It's certainly, on the one hand, China is continuing to seek opportunities to enhance its influence and to undermine the influence of Australia and of our allies, particularly in the security space. On the other hand, at least some Pacific Island governments continue to see benefit in fostering Chinese activity and indeed in fostering geostrategic competition more generally, motivated by, well, a desire to maximise development finances, motivated by a desire to demonstrate diplomatic even-handedness, to hedge their bets, and in some cases by less exalted motives, if I can be diplomatic. All that said, I don't think China is having things all its own way, and maybe we can get into that a bit more in the discussion. A word on the United States. I think USAID was a significant player in the region. It's on a par with New Zealand and China, the cluster of frankly, second order donors, whereas you've got Australia sort of standing head and shoulders above them. I think USAID's the abolition of USAID and the removal of funding is being felt in the region. But the larger problem, it seems to me, is the reputational issue that the US has inflicted on itself and by extension on its allies. So this is really, I'm saying it's an emerging problem. I mean, it's clear that it's a problem now, but I'm not sure we understand yet just the dimensions of that problem and how serious that's going to be for us. Finally, the third set of issues on Australia's access and influence. Without going around the region on a country-by-country basis, I think it's fair to say that our bilateral relationships, by and large, are in reasonably good shape. Certainly, that's the impression that Papua New Guinea's foreign minister gave a couple of weeks ago when he said he hoped our government would be re-elected because they're doing a good job. So, it was, I'm sure, music to the government's ears. It's incidentally the sort of comment that would be completely howled down if it was ever made by an Australian foreign minister about a government in the Pacific. Look, and it's easy to point to the numbers like, the size of the aid program to the Pacific. So it's now at the highest level it's ever been, both in absolute terms. So that's, $2.2 billion a year directed at the Pacific, and also proportionally. So it's 43% of the whole aid program now goes to the Pacific. 10 or so years ago, that was about a quarter. So it's far and away the largest single part of the aid budget. What I really want to talk about, though, in this limited time available, and I'm conscious of the clock, is the way that the government's policy toolkit has expanded well beyond the time when aid was really the dominant policy lever for government. If we want to think of an overarching theme for this trend in policy, I think it's best summed up in the idea of integration. Okay, and this is an idea, in fact, first set out under the previous government in the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. Let me just give you, there's a little quote from that white paper. The government's delivering a step change in our engagement with the Pacific. This recognises that more ambitious engagement by Australia, including helping to integrate Pacific countries into the Australian and New Zealand economies and our security institutions, is essential to the long-term stability and economic prospects of the Pacific. So I think this is an idea that has been very much picked up by our current government and is really now a guiding principle of Australia's approach to the region. And you can see it expressed in a range of initiatives and from a range of perspectives. I mean, at a rhetorical level, the previous government and this government talk all the time about our Pacific family. Now, a lot of people think that's kind of cheesy, but it is encapsulating this idea of helping to integrate the Pacific with Australia and New Zealand. Much more tangibly, you've got the growth of labour mobility between the Pacific and Australia. So at the moment, you've got something like 30,000 Pacific Islanders working in Australia in various industries. That's come off well, from 0 15 years ago. It's stabilised at around this level of 30,000. And it's a bit unclear, despite the demand that's out there, just where, if that's going to grow or not in future. I think there's certainly a lot of scope for that to grow, but it's a great example of integrating the workforces of the Pacific and Australia. Another initiative of this government is the Pacific Engagement Visa. It's just started last year. So this is this new visa specifically dedicated for the Pacific, which will allow 3,000 Pacific Islanders to migrate to Australia every year. So countries are assigned quotas. People apply. It's a ballot situation. And this is quite consciously designed to promote greater people-to-people links, to anchor our communities more closely together. Because if you look at the last few censuses, or the last census, when people were asked, what ancestry do you have, just over 1% of people living in Australia said, I come from a Pacific Islands background. That's really pretty small, especially if you compare it to New Zealand, where the answer to that question would be about 16%. And in particular, where, there's more Cook Islanders in Australia than Papua New Guineans. That's really weird. So I think this Pacific Engagement Visa is a very interesting initiative. You've got some really groundbreaking treaties, particularly between Australia and Tuvalu and Australia and Nauru. Okay, the Tuvalu agreement, the Whalapili Union, a couple of years old now, that gives a special visa category to Tuvalu. It allows a number of, I think the figure's a bit over 200 Tuvaluans to migrate to Australia every year. It gives Australia a strategic veto over Tuvalu's security decision-making, right? If I can quote briefly, Tuvalu shall mutually agree with Australia any partnership, arrangement or engagement with any other state or entity on security and defence-related matters, right? So Australia now has a veto essentially over Tuvalu's external security relationships. Really interesting. I think it's probably the most interesting policy initiative, in the foreign policy space of the government. There's an agreement with Nauru last year, and it essentially uses the same language. Nauru shall mutually agree with Australia any partnership, arrangement or engagement with any other state or entity on matters relating to Nauru's security. Interesting, right? But I think, this comes under this broad heading of integration. More broadly in the area of security, I think the Australian government's been working very hard to convince Pacific Island countries that we are part of a single security community, that yes, they are sovereign nations, but that their sovereign decisions affect our national security. And language to that effect has been put forward by Australia in a number of bilateral agreements. That hasn't stopped a country like Solomon Islands signing an agreement with China. But we do have, Papua New Guinea has approached Australia about a defence treaty. Okay, again, it's not Australia approaching Papua New Guinea. It's the other way around. An interesting development. There's a whole range of initiatives in the security space. At my university, ANU, we've got this thing called the Pacific Security College, which has been set up explicitly to foster a cohort of officials around the region that know each other, that think along lines I think that we want to be comfortable with when it comes to security decision making. There's more recently a Pacific policing initiative, which is based around a headquarters in Brisbane, and I'll finish in a minute. We are seconding, we've got secondees from the Papua New Guinea Defence Force and the Fiji military already in at high levels in the ADF. So that's all, I think, very interesting. The private sector, the government's intervened directly to make sure that, well, firstly, in a sense, to underwrite Telstra's ongoing presence around the region. That was against the risk that a company like Huawei or some other Chinese company would just buy up Pacific Island telcos. So that's, I think, directly working with Telstra. More recently, government's come to an agreement with ANZ to keep the ANZ present in the region. And of course, one of the great integration initiatives is having a Papua New Guinean team in the NRL, right? It's going to cost us taxpayers a lot of money. But, you know, again, it makes sense under this logic of integration. So all of that's a work in progress. And, you know, in the case of the NRL, it hasn't even started yet. And I think, you know, there's been progress in some areas more than others. But I think they are all indicative of a wish to really thicken the links between Australia and the Pacific. They also point to, I think, a future agenda for integration. So there is still a lot of pressure around the Pacific to improve the freedom, particularly freedom of access into Australia, right? Pacific Islanders regularly say, look at New Zealand, how come they just come and go? Why can't we enjoy the same privileges? I think there are areas like the provision of shared services led by Australia, the area of cybersecurity, for instance. Pacific Island countries are really very poorly set up to address that challenge. And we were talking about this before we started, but recruitment of Pacific Islanders into the ADF, I think, is something that's being talked about. So one thing I haven't talked about much is climate change, okay? It's still an issue between Australia and the Pacific. And it's probably the area of greatest difference between the two sides of politics in Australia. But frankly, unless we all elect a Green government, like a majority Greens government, we're not going to satisfy the Pacific, right? There will always be a gap between Australian policy positions and the demands of Pacific Island governments, whether we have a coalition government or a Labor government. I think that's an unresolvable gap, just given the political factors in Australia. So I said at the beginning that the picture's a mixed one because it will always be a mixed one. I think that shouldn't be a counsel of despair or of complacency. But I'm really encouraged by the willingness of successive governments to innovate in policy in responding to some of the challenges that we're seeing. Hasn't solved all those challenges, but I think that level of policy attention and innovation really needs to be sustained as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. That sets us up for a good discussion, I think. We'll turn immediately to questions if people could identify themselves when they get the call and speak up. But first, let me ask, James, you're talking about integration as a way for Australian policy in the region, but is there an inherent problem with capacity constraints on the part of the Pacific neighbourhood? And was listening to the ABC reporting today in the lead up to the election, talking to people in Fiji and also in PNG about what they make of Australian aid to their countries. And they said, well, we like it, but we want to have more say in how it's used. So it made me think, well, is there an issue here with top-down approach, which gets under the skin of our friends in the Pacific?
No, the problem is, because, if you listen to some of this commentary, you'd think that Australia goes in and just says, this is how it's going to be, right? Now, anyone that's worked in the Pacific knows that's not how it works. I think the problem is there is a real accountability gap between Pacific Island governments and Pacific Island populations. We necessarily deal and negotiate with Pacific Island governments about the shape of our aid program. We do that all the time, right? And indeed now we are also consulting with civil society. I think DFAT is bending over backwards to do that. You are simply not going to meet everyone's expectations, right? I think we can change our emphasis, perhaps. I suspect we should be doing a bit more in the area of civil society, but the aid program is responding to multiple demands and multiple incentives simultaneously. It is never going to satisfy everyone. So like I said, this is one of these areas where I just think you have to say, well, we do our best, but it is so easy to critique the aid program because everyone's got a priority. It's not infinite, right? And well, I could go on, but I won't.
All right, that's fine. I think we had a question over here. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Etienne. I'm with the Canadian High Commission here in Canberra. I'm also covering the Pacific Island countries as well as New Zealand on cyber and digital issues. I guess not going too deep into my specialty, I was interested more in your views about the Pacific Islands Forum and efforts in working together. You mentioned multiple times that it's not one unified group, but there are efforts towards finding common ground. And I'm interested to know about your views about where is it going.
Yep.
Forum.
Great question. So, I think it's one of Australia's great assets that it is a member of the Pacific Islands Forum. It's got a seat at the table. I think the forum, it's the preeminent body in the region. It will continue to struggle. We'll continue to face constraints, let's say. I think countries in the region are extremely reluctant to surrender sovereignty to a supranational body. They're very reluctant to see the forum go down that path. So it remains extremely important as a political clearinghouse, a place for discussion. But I can't see it developing kind of EU-type characteristics. It also faces problems of there are now enough members, the 18 members, that you've got very lively factionalism, sub-regionalism, right? And there was an extreme example of that when a Polynesian was appointed as Secretary General and the Micronesians said, that's it, we're leaving the forum, right? And Australia made a mistake in that one because we supported the Polynesian candidate. But that kind of underline, just that sort of issue is very difficult for the forum to manage. I think they'll get by because they always do. The other issue, I think the forum, there's still 3 members of the forum that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And I think the forum really struggles to develop a common foreign policy or approach on security. It's easy for the forum to say, climate change is the greatest security issue we face. Sure, everyone agrees with that. On the geopolitics, though, it's a lot harder. You know, a number of countries say we're neutral, we're friends to all, enemies to none. That's not true right across the region, though. Countries that have got the compact states in the North Pacific are much more open. You know, the president of Palau said, please, can we have a US base here? You know, we see China as a threat. They're happy to call that out. Plus the US has a strategic veto in that part of the world. We now have a strategic veto in the case of Tuvalu and Nauru. In the case of Fiji, clearly they went from this neutralist position. Rambuka is much more obviously sympathetic towards traditional partners. I think even in Papua New Guinea, I think they're quite clearly expressing that Australia is our preferred security partner. Happy to have an economic relationship with China, but not a security one. So all that means that it's hard for the forum to come to an agreed position on the great geopolitical question. And again, it's why Australia feels, you know, we've got to be a leader here. We've got to shape opinion, as well as being a partner, just being a member of the forum.
All right. Ernst and then Desmond and James.
Thank you, Scott. You may be familiar with an article in the Institute's Journal of International Affairs around the middle of last year, where the author painted a less benign picture of Australia's relations with the South Pacific. One of the points made was that Australian policy is seen by the South Pacific Islanders as paternalistic. In relation to the South Pacific Forum, the author cites a confrontation between the Prime Minister of Fiji and former Prime Minister Morrison, in which the Fijian Prime Minister said Australia should not be in the South Pacific Forum. You've said that Australian policies are bipartisan. My sense is that they're rather different. Am I wrong? And if Australia is successful in getting the next COP, and that would be in Adelaide, do you think that would enhance or make more difficult our relationship with the South Pacific?
Well, there's a few
Few
issues
questions there, yeah.
in there, and in the interest of transparency, let me declare I have form when it comes to Prime Minister Bainimarama, because I was expelled from Fiji by him when I was High Commissioner there. You know, the curious thing that, you know, Bainimarama sort of performatively had an argument with Scott Morrison at the forum. Then strangely enough, it didn't prevent us from having quite a productive relationship with Fiji, including in the security space, right? So Morrison and Bainimarama sealed the deal for us to develop the BlackRock peacekeeping and humanitarian centre. Climate change advocates would like you to believe that climate change is the only issue in our relations with the Pacific, and it just isn't, right? I just think that's looking down the wrong end of the telescope. So I would respectfully disagree with you. I think essentially, climate change aside, our policy is basically bipartisan in Australia towards the Pacific. On this issue of paternalism, again, it's such an easy accusation to make. I just think it's one that Australia will never win. We're just too big. I don't think we are. I mean, is my view on that. I think people sometimes have an incentive to say that, but it's part of the territory of when it comes, you know, this need to shape our region. So, you know, governments don't shy away from saying that. We do want to shape our region. If people perceive that to be paternalistic, again, I think that's rhetoric. I was just reading a great book by Quarry University academic Stephanie Lawson called Regional Politics in Oceania, and I commend it highly to everyone. But she's looked deeply into this question. So Makary Murata did a review of the forum about 10 years ago, the former PNG Prime Minister, and went looking for this paternalism and couldn't find it, and wrote in his report, sort of, really? Australia and New Zealand bend over backwards not to be the first people to speak at forum meetings, right? But it's always going to be easy to make that claim. It's just inescapable. It comes with the territory.
All right, Desmond.
You mentioned that governments in the Pacific Islands aren't always acting in the best interest of their own people, particularly when it comes to the distribution of aid. During the last 12 months, I and many other Rotarians have been involved in providing the National Referral Hospital at Honiara with potable water. It had got to the point where it was degraded beyond the ability to drink it. We've also managed to make the place malarial mosquito proof. Now, this is trivial sums, $50,000 does it. Simultaneously, my understanding is that Mr. Sogavari, when asked by the Chinese what he wanted money spent on, said, well, the presidential palace badly needs restoration. It needs to be turned from an old government house into something suitable for someone of my importance. And millions got spent there. Is this an example of the sort of thing you're talking about? And are there other examples that I'm not aware of?
Yeah, look, I think there are plenty of examples. I mean, the sporting stadium that China built for Solomon Islands, it's magnificent, but there is no way Solomon's is going to be able to afford to keep it up, to maintain it in future. So I fear what it will look like in 5 years' time, to be honest. It's going to be a real burden. Look, I think, yes, there are plenty of examples where if I was running Solomon Islands or another country, I don't want to specify this to a particular country, there might be things that I would do differently. Of course, in this day and age, we have to be very careful about saying we know what's best for you, right? At a certain, Pacific Island countries are democracies. They do have elections. Their governments can legitimately say to us, we're elected democratically. We speak on behalf of our people. We can have disagreements about where we allocate resources, but in the end, I remember when I was the High Commissioner in Tuvalu, they were spending at least a third of their health budget sending politicians, civil servants and their children to have high-level medical care in Australia. When we're saying, well, really, your primary healthcare system is pretty starved of funds. Is that a wise allocation of your resources? And, told that's our sovereign decision. Thank you very much. So, it's not necessarily just a case of open and shut case. There can be legitimate room for debate about what's a priority. In Solomon Islands, one of the single biggest expenditures in the budget is for constituency development funds for individual members of parliament to spend in their own electorates. I think it's pretty wasteful expenditure, but Solomon Islanders say, actually, members of parliament know their people. They know the needs of their people. And most Solomon Islanders actually agree with this system because it's one way of getting at least some sort of support. I don't think it's a good way to run a country, but it's not my country. So, you know, this is what policy dialogue is supposed to be about, right? And in this day and age, that's one of the things that aid programs are supposed to be about, that we sit down with host governments and have a dialogue and say, you know, what are the policies you're pursuing? How are you allocating your resources? It's not just writing a check. And, you know, these are supposed to be relationships of trust, where we can confidently discuss issues without it ending in a brawl. So that is, that's a way I think that we can help to shape policy decisions. But look, in the end, we can't. We're not running those countries. They are sovereign countries. I think we're more flexible than the World Bank, can I say?
Is that a
But that's not saying much. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. No, it does.
James, did you have a question?
Thanks very much, James. You said some very interesting and encouraging words about thickening of the relationships between the countries, between the peoples of the Pacific and Australia too. What about going the other way? Because most of the examples you gave were of Pacific Islanders having greater access through various means to Australia. Are there any programs in place, or are there any developments, regardless of programs, which see more Australians thickening our relations as Australians with the Pacific Islands?
Not a lot that I can immediately put my finger on, although can I say I am taking a group of undergraduates to Vanuatu in June and July under the New Colombo plan. Okay, so that's, and that happens from a number of universities to I think basically most Pacific Island countries these days. This is under the sort of short-term mobility program, but that's going to be for a month. So that's kind of one example that springs to mind. In an organised fashion, I'm not sure how else. I guess we will have in our all teams flying up to Papua New Guinea from 2028. So that'll be another instance, but no, good question.
What about in academia? The interest of students in studying the South Pacific?
Well, again, I'm just speaking from my experience. I started teaching in a course on Australia and the Pacific at ANU maybe 9 years ago, and we had 36 students. We now have 200, and we have to cap it at 200 because it just gets unwieldy. So, and that's been the case for the last few years or so. I think students are certainly picking up those signals, and mine's not the only one. It's probably the biggest single course on the Pacific, though. So that's a good sign.
Okay.
Thank you. Penny Wensley, Fellow of the Institute. Thinking about these issues of access and influence, I'm interested to know what the current approach is in relation to media and that side of so-called soft diplomacy, because I recall a few years ago there was consternation about Radio Australia pulling out or being stopped, and China moving in quite a big way. Where does all of that sit at the moment? Because it does seem to me to be a very, very important dimension of our presence and the way in which we can have access and influence.
Yeah.
Right, good shot.
That wasn't supposed to happen.
Well, I won't be in the NRL team. Okay.
So Radio Australia is still going strong, but it's broadcasting these days on FM,
Yes.
which is actually easier to hear. It's the short wave that's gone.
Yes.
You know, I go and stay in a village in Vanuatu. No one has shortwave radios anymore.
Oh,
They really don't. So, you know, the work that Radio Australia is doing is really good. I think the aid program is very engaged in a program called PATMAS, Pacific Media. Not sure what it stands for. So I think there's a fair bit of work in that space. And I'm not really across the details, Penny, I'm sorry, but I think it's acknowledged in government. There's probably more we could do. But I think my sense is we're reasonably active. Yeah.
thank you.
Questions over this side? Yes, please.
Well, thank you first of all, thank you for the discussion. I'm an intern at the Dutch Embassy and I'm also still a student. I haven't heard you say the Europe once,
Right.
or the EU or some other countries in the space. So I was wondering what's your opinion about Europe itself and its role in the Pacific, and now especially when USA has fallen away. Do you see a window of opportunity, or do you see a role for Europe in general in the Pacific?
So, I mean, I think the EU is a particularly important aid donor in the Pacific. I think that's a really valuable role and contribution that Europe's making. I suppose, I mean, a lot of people see the EU through the lens of the French, because you know, France's role in the Pacific is very important. And it plays an outsized role, I suppose. What else can I say? I mean, I think from Australia's point of view, yes, the EU is a positive presence. It's a force multiplier, along with New Zealand, Japan, Korea, you know, the broadly like-minded community of countries. Does that help?
What do you think now? USA, I think, left the gap as well financially.
Yes, it
Do you
has.
think now China can jump in that gap, or do you think there's a window of opportunity for Europe to increase their funding or spending in the Pacific?
Well, if Europe's got the funds, you know, please step up. I mean, I think the coalition was announcing the other day that they want to increase the amount of money available to our loan scheme in the Pacific, AIFFP, to partly backfill that problem. But please, the EU would be more than welcome.
Might just inject an online question here from Tess Newton-Kane. Increased use of strategic transactionalism by Australia in bilateral relationships. You mentioned some, Nauru Treaty, PNG, NRL deal, etc., brings significant risks not only to other bilateral relationships, but to regionalism more broadly. How can those risks be mitigated?
Well, you know, regionalism has never been the be-all and end-all. I think this is one of Australia's great strengths in the Pacific, that it can operate simultaneously as a member of the regional organisations, but also bilaterally with individual countries. And you know, it's not as if there's ever been a golden age of regionalism that we're looking back on. So you know, yes, there are, I guess there are tensions within the regional system, but you know, there always have been. And you know, I think, well, I'm not sure, Tess, this is a hard question. I'm not sure I can say anything more than
That's
that.
fine. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, Ian.
Ian Hudgens,
You mentioned very briefly France. France is important in a number of ways. Can you talk more about the integration of France into the Pacific? Is there integration? And what happens at both the senior level of government to government versus the indigenous level?
Well, I mean, in one sense, France is very integrated these days because both of its territories, New Caledonia and French Polynesia, are now members of the Pacific Islands Forum. So that, even though France will say, oh, you know, that's a distinction, it certainly does seem to give France at least an arm's length seat at the table, if I'm not mixing my metaphors too much. France, Australia and New Zealand have for a long time cooperated on disaster relief. There's a formal agreement between the three. So that remains a very important part of France's role. I don't know, on the sort of grassroots, I think it's much harder for me to offer a view. I mean, I'm not sure I know that much about it. Language is a barrier, I think. I mean, that it does make it harder for us to engage with that part of the Pacific. I don't know what more I can say. Sorry, Ian.
Particularly with the Kanak
Well,
stresses, does that spread to other countries in the Pacific?
Well, there's certainly strong support for independence amongst the Melanesian countries, and Vanuatu in particular, and there has been for decades. And I think the forum has, you know, has tried to find a role for itself, not with a great deal of success, I don't think. You know, there's been some fact-finding missions that have gone in to New Caledonia over the years. But, you know, the future of New Caledonia is going to be resolved between the population on the ground and France. I'm not sure what role the forum's going to play, or a country like Australia. Perhaps slightly different to Bougainville, who knows? Poor old Margaret's had her hand up.
Okay, Margaret, then.
Hello, Margaret. James's successor after 7-year gap in Fiji. James, you talked a bit about the reputational damage of US foreign policy at the moment as a strong ally in the region. I just wanted to ask if go back a step. I was rather shocked, I suppose I shouldn't have been, when the UN General Assembly did its vote on Ukraine in February this year. And the US, obviously on instruction from the new administration, sided with Russia. And if you looked at the voting board, the 3 compact states, 2 also sided with Russia and 1 abstained. So I thought that was a fascinating little amuse-bouche on what's likely ahead of us in that context. Are you hearing or seeing anything, because I'm finding it very hard to follow, about sentiment in Palau, Marshall Islands and FSM on their future relationship with the US? Is there a fear of abandonment, for example, going on?
Look, in a word, no, I'm not. Sorry, I really don't have anything to offer on that. Yeah, but it's obviously going to be something worth watching.
All right, there was a question through there, yes.
I have a question in relation to these integration initiatives, which are largely based around increasing visas for Pacific Islanders to come to Australia. Are you concerned that this may contribute to brain drains in Pacific Island countries? And if I may, a quick second question.
Yes.
What do you think it was that convinced Tuvalu to allow Australia to have strategic veto?
So the answer to the second question is, I think, partly the access that we gave Tuvalu in terms of allowing Tuvaluans to migrate to Australia, but probably also the fact that Australia has now agreed in a treaty to recognise the sovereignty of Tuvalu, irrespective of what happens with sea level rise, right? So if Tuvalu disappears under the waves, Australia is still going to recognise a country called Tuvalu. That's pretty unique, I think, internationally, and it's groundbreaking in terms of the Law of the Sea Convention. So that's an interesting, I think, commitment for us to have made to Tuvalu. On your first question, their employers in Fiji are getting quite worked up about brain drain these days. But I think it's not, well, academics that are a lot smarter than me say that it's not necessarily just a linear process. Okay, there are feedback mechanisms in migration that mean that, you know, remittances might become more important, going back to the homeland. If people have 2 passports, well, they can come and go, right? They might come and get an anchor in Australia, but then they can go back to the country that they've come from. So I think it's emerging as an issue. I don't think it's going to be a showstopper. I mean, I think eventually people will vote with their feet, right? Ultimately, governments can't just put a wall around their countries and say no one can leave. That in itself is sending a signal to Pacific Island governments that time for some reform, you know, if people are voting with their feet. So, that debate will become, I think, more prominent. Yeah.
All right, well, the time has just about elapsed. Have you got a quick one there?
Yeah.
All right, then.
I'm just from the Netherlands Embassy, and so since your great experience in there, do you have any idea or comments about the recent developments in the Solomon Islands, in particular regarding the actions of the ex-Prime Minister Sogavare?
Well, I can't tell you who's going to be the Prime Minister next week, if that's what your question is. But I mean, no, I mean, are you talking about just the politics in the last? So
the last few days of the political crisis is now happening. It's very.
It's not unusual in terms of Solomon Islands political history. So they've had many of these sorts of events in the past. I don't know how it's going to end up.
All right. We might draw a line on it just there. Thank you very much, James, on behalf of
Sorry for spilling the
Not at all. It's just about
water.
evaporated now. On behalf of the ACT branch of the AIIA, we'd like to thank you very much for coming and being frank with your views and covering a lot of ground for us. And as a small token of our appreciation, I'd like you to walk away with one of these.
Thank you very much.